little confession to make. I was beginning to do a deep dive into the scriptures for next week, and I included in the bulletin Luke 21, 1 through 4, and that's part of next week's service. So, rest assured I'm looking ahead, but we'll be skipping that one this week. Thank you. God keeps me so humble. Ramez Atala, General Director of the Bible Society of Egypt, attended an international conference for Christian leaders in 1974. He was thrilled to be with the top-notch leaders from around the globe, sharing and reading interesting papers on very important subjects. But the most meaningful insight actually came to him on the flight home. Atala remembers. It was a long flight back to Canada, and I had many papers to go through. I had taken a lot of business cards from all sorts of important global Christian leaders that I had met. We all know we collect these cards, put them in pockets, and often forget about them. As I looked through my cards from the conference, I noticed one that was not very well printed, and I looked at it carefully. I still get emotional when I remember this story, because it broke me. At the conference, we had small groups every night. About 10 of us met in our dormitory rooms to pray and share together. The first night, we introduced ourselves. President of a seminary, pastor of a church with 2,000 members, and so on. Everybody was showing how great they were. I said that I led the InterVarsity movement in the province of Quebec. It was actually a very small ministry, but it sounded good. One African man who was with us said, "I'm a pastor in Kenya." During the week, we all listened to each other. I didn't pay a lot of attention to the pastor from Kenya. I wanted to get close to the important people. But I was moved by the Kenyan pastor's stories of how God had touched him as a school teacher during the African revival and changed his life. I thought he was a deep man. I pictured him working in a humble little village in Africa. But when I picked up that business card on the plane back to Canada, I discovered that it said, Festo Olang, Archbishop of Kenya. Olang was a man who could pull rank on anyone in that group. He was a big wig, but we didn't know it. He didn't tell us. He did not use his position to secure his identity. He was a simple pastor who loved Jesus. I'm still moved to the core when I remember this incident, and I said to myself on that plane, that's the kind of leader I want to be. That's leadership, Jesus style. For the last time, Jesus entered Jerusalem for the Passover. As he entered from the east, Herod Antipas was also entering the city from the west, as was his custom every year. Herod rode on a massive war horse, surrounded by an army of soldiers clad in their colorful uniforms and helmets, armed to the teeth. You can almost hear the clanking of their armor and the hoofbeats of their horses, as well as the thunder of those on foot. It was a show of force meant to put fear in the people of Jerusalem and squash any resistance to the government. People gathered to watch Herod's military parade quietly, most likely with drawn faces filled with anxiety. Herod was not on the side of the people, but was on the side of Rome. But from the opposite direction of the great city came Jesus, Messiah, God with us. He rode on a borrowed donkey, surrounded by unarmed disciples. His purpose was to demonstrate the kingship of God and to offer peace. The sound that grew was not that of a military parade, but the shouts of joy proclaiming Jesus, a blessed King who comes in the name of the Lord. The Pharisees approached Jesus in the midst of the throng and told him to silence the people. But Jesus answered that if the people were quiet, the very stones surrounding them would shout out at his appearance. In 2016, the Oseti-Sakowin camp had been there for months, full of water protectors, resisting proposed plans for the Dakota Access Pipeline to cross a dam section of the Missouri River not far from the lands of the Standing Rock Sioux. Other waves of supporters had come before them, waves of clergy, waves of sympathetic activists. This looked like just another wave. This time, it was military veterans. But as they approached, they did an astonishing thing. Standing in formation before the tribal leaders, they dropped to their knees. They recited a list of atrocities that American military had perpetuated against Native Americans throughout the years. Then they literally begged for forgiveness. Of course, we don't know the name and history of every single person there that day, but it's probably safe to assume that most of them did not personally commit any of the injustices they mentioned. They chose to bear the iniquities of their ancestors as a way of making things right in the present. Neither was Jesus the creator of any of the systems that destroyed him so long ago. The forces of empire, the greed of client kings, the cowardice of religious leaders, the fickleness of crowds, the betrayal of friends, the tyranny of the powerful over the weak. And yet he chose to bear them in his own body and make things right in the present and for the future. Tears flowed at Standing Rock and on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. Tears that proved deep sorrow, broken hearts, and mighty love. Jesus, who didn't have to, went to the cross with the weight of others' sins on his back. The vets at Standing Rock, who didn't have to either, bowed low under that same kind of weight. And in each of those moments, something of salvation entered the world. Last weekend, I was able to go to Port Clinton and spend some time with some of my clergy sisters. On Sunday night, 4 of us sat down to play a game called True Colors. I'd never played it before, but it was pretty much fun. Each person takes a card with a pre-printed question on it, and then votes for the person or persons who most closely represents that question. You get 2 votes before you pass it on to the next person so they can vote. And one of the questions was, who is the person you'd least like to be angry with you? When I read the card, I busted up laughing. Because last year, one of the members of that little group got angry with 2 of us in that little group. An experience I never want to repeat the rest of my life. Usually this colleague is very easygoing and accepting of different voices and different thoughts. I had never seen her angry before. But she got pushed as far as she could go. And as the card made its way around the table, it was greeted with equal laughter, which only increased when we revealed our votes and she won the round unanimously. None of us wanted her to be angry at us. I wonder if Jesus had been pushed as far as he could go when he arrived at the temple that day. He spent 3 years talking with folks about God, talking about God's relationship with them and their relationship with God and how their relationship should look like with one another. And here in the temple, where those in power gouged those who were poorest, where those in power cheated, berated, and discriminated against people who could least afford it. Here is where Jesus said enough. And he became angry. Facing death, a sacrifice for everyone. He longed for people to understand. He longed to know that a sacrifice would make a difference, that they would embrace the good news that he was proclaiming. While the tragedy at the temple included Jesus' forceful anger toward the desecration of the holy, the greater tragedy was that Jesus' actions that day was the straw that broke the back for the conniving religious leaders. And Jesus knew it. Knowing his actions would set off a string of events that would lead to his betrayal, his arrest, trial, and death on a cross, Jesus did it anyway. He could no longer just speak and teach and show people how to love. He had to demonstrate the courage and boldness of God's kingdom by literally turning the tables. He knew that this demonstration would be the end of his earthly life, but he did what was needed to be done. And through this action taught us a great lesson of our faith. If we truly believe and follow our God, we also must be willing to put ourselves on the line for what is right, even if that means personal rejection, even if that we will have to sacrifice our personal wealth, even if we have to give up our personal comfort. Because willingness to embrace the cost of discipleship is what discipleship is all about. May the Holy Spirit make us bold in turning the tables of these, the time we live in.